my name is Hannah Rasmussen, and I'm a recent graduate from Africa International University in Kenya. I'm really grateful to present at this ASM conference today. And the focus of my paper is that many people are already bicultural before they engage in mission. What models do we have for their role in the Missio Day? We need a bicultural model because what we have are mostly models that assume missionaries start out monocultural and encounter a monocultural environment when they begin mission, and then they become bicultural. So, for example, Dwayne Elmer's model says people from squarehead land lose a few corners, adapting to roundhead land. Or Hebert says missionaries and locals create a new fusion biculture that's a bridge for the gospel. But in a globalizing world, more people have mixed identities before their ministry begins. They could be adoptees, immigrants, children of intercultural marriages, or third culture kids, as depicted in these illustrations. How do they engage in mission? Even the most obvious example, missionary kids, are usually discussed more in terms of their own cultural and emotional needs or how they relate to their parents' faith and ministry, rather than their unique role in mission. How can we form a model for bicultural people? Well, let's look to the Bible. Moses, Joseph, Daniel, Esther, and Paul all encountered multiple cultures at a young age and later ministered in cross-cultural or hybrid settings. Their names give clues to their bicultural identities. Joseph names his sons Hebrew names, yet their meaning shows his lack of belonging. The home of his past reminds him of trouble, but Egypt is the land of his suffering. We don't know what Moses' mother actually called him. If Pharaoh's daughter was the one to name him, how likely is it that Moses really meant draw out in Hebrew? One commentator suggests it might be the Hebrew transliteration of the Egyptian word for boy child, which was probably the word in Pharaoh's proclamation to kill them. If so, the author hides Moses' Egyptianness for a Hebrew audience. He was rescued from Egyptian oppression, the boy child that lived, but that's exactly why the people reject him as their rescuer. Daniel switches between his own names in chapter 4. In the king's dialogue, it calls him Belshazzar, but he calls himself Daniel. He also switches languages in the book, beginning in Hebrew, then Aramaic, then Hebrew, just like Daniel's life began in Israel, then in Babylon, and then he lived to see the exiles return to Judea. Of course, this serves a missional purpose of communicating to both Jewish and non-Jewish audiences. Esther is introduced by her Jewish name Hadassah, which has associations with prophetic literature, and called by her lineage immediately before she goes to the king. But throughout the rest of the book, she's called Esther, of the same root as the Babylonian goddess Ishtar. This mirrors how the way she is known to Mordecai is quickly hidden once she enters the Persian court. Saul's name, as we heard, evokes his true Israelite heritage of the Benjamite king, a fact that he actually points out in his first recorded sermon in Acts. But he becomes a more Gentile-friendly Paul the Apostle, first called that when he goes on his first missionary journey to Cyprus. From then on, he's only called Saul in his retelling of the conversion narrative. My model finds that these bicultural people in the Bible go through 4 stages. First, they identify with more than one culture as a result of circumstances outside their control, rather than with full awareness of the missional purposes of cultural adaptation, making them different from typical missionaries. On this list, you'll notice every circumstance happens outside the person's control and before adulthood, whether you take that as age 18 or being married. They're oblivious to the way this is going to prepare them for their mission. Joseph's jealous brothers sell him into slavery in Egypt at age 17. Moses escapes genocide by Egyptian foster care as an infant. Daniel is taken into Babylonian exile as a teenager and indoctrinated in the culture of Babylon to serve the government of his oppressor. Esther is an orphan exile conscripted into the Persian king's harem as a young virgin. Paul is born a citizen of Rome and Tarsus, a Hellenistic center, circumcised Benjamite and Pharisee under Gamaliel, as we just heard in the previous presentation. Their second stage is experiencing rejection from at least one culture because they're seen as different. Again, noting the previous presentation about the troubled situation in Paul's life. We see this in the other characters as well. Joseph, of course, rejected by his brothers for being the favored child. Then he acculturates in Egypt well enough to be entrusted with the highest level of responsibility in Potiphar's house, in the prison, and in Pharaoh's court. Yet he's still rejected in Egypt. He's kicked out of Potiphar's household with xenophobic tones used in the language there. Potiphar's wife calls him this Hebrew, that Hebrew slave. In prison, despite his favor that he experiences, he's still noticeably a young Hebrew to the cupbearer. As we find with Daniel as well, successful bicultural people can be the target of jealousy because the in-group perceives them as outsiders undeserving of success. Moses tries to identify with Israel, calling them his own people twice, by rejecting Egyptian privilege and siding with the Hebrew slave in a violent moment. But the passage repeats Hebrew to highlight his difference from this person. Moses finds himself mistrusted by the Hebrews and permanently alienated from Pharaoh, more desperate for a people and farther from attaining a home than ever. Daniel takes Jeremiah's advice to seek the peace and prosperity of Babylon. He accepts Chaldean training, even though they're known for their witchcraft and all these other idolatry. But he chooses food that doesn't make him an ally, with obligations to be loyal to the king. Daniel acculturates well enough that his fellow officials can only find fault if they invent a conflict between Babylonian law and his religion. But he still experiences that rejection from them. Esther acculturates by accepting the eunuch's advice. She doesn't refuse Gentile food like Daniel because she'd have to eat her husband's food if she became queen. Yet she maintains connection to Mordecai by sending him news. While she hides her identity, she is still rejected by proxy of Mordecai as she watches Haman threaten him. She shows us how bicultural people can carry an internalized rejection. If they knew who I really was, my culture, my values, they wouldn't accept me. Paul. His hateful hunt for Christians makes it no surprise that Ananias and the disciples are afraid of him, nor that the Jews turn that same hate against him when he betrays them by changing camps. Both groups are persecuted minorities in an oppressive land whose existence is threatened. Yet Paul also identifies with the believers. Ananias obeys and calls him Brother Saul, and Barnabas welcomes him in. Still, Paul has to escape Jewish threats on his life, first fleeing to Jerusalem and then to Tarsus. I wonder if he thought, which of my former homes will be safe? Despite this rejection, they continue to identify with these cultures in the third step of my model. Joseph joins the Egyptian government. He adopts their dress, transportation, and accepts a new name. He also marries into the religious elite. Yet he also continues to identify with his father's faith. He maintains his Hebrew conviction that God, not a specialist, is the one who can interpret dreams. We already mentioned that he named his children with Hebrew names. It's interesting about Moses because sometimes bicultural people are called global nomads. And Moses, in fact, finds his home among literal nomads, the Midianites. Gersham's name shows how he felt like a stranger in Egypt. It takes a burning bush to change his mind to go back. God reminds him of his birth father, ancestors, and the Hebrew suffering. God calls them my people, and by the end of the conversation, Moses does too. The book of Hebrews later commends Moses for identifying with Israel rather than Egypt. His yearning for a country of his own turns into leading Israel back to his same mountain. In Daniel's case, when the king says he'll kill the wise men unless they tell him his dream, Daniel prays to the God of my ancestors. But he later describes God for an astral worship context as the God of heaven. He saves both Babylonian and Jewish wise men and accepts serving the foreign king in a higher capacity. Daniel also continues to observe Jewish prayer times, even when it costs him. Yet, in his civil disobedience, he still accepts Babylonian law and its punishment. Esther also continues to identify with both cultures. She seeks out Mordecai when he's mourning. When she hears Jews are threatened by her husband's community, she abandons neither her husband's community nor the Jews. She prays and fasts with the Jews and feasts with the king and the enemy. Paul uses his rabbinic training to debate in synagogues and his Hellenistic training to quote philosophers. He's rejected often because he contextualizes too well. People realize the claims he's making threaten their interests, whether blacksmiths and fortune tellers or Jews. He also navigates this danger using his identities. In a Jerusalem riot, he tells the Roman soldier in Greek that he is a Jew and a citizen of Tarsus, no ordinary city. Then repeats it in Aramaic to the Jewish crowd, but adds that he's brought up in Jerusalem. Finally, he plays his Roman citizen card to avoid flogging. The last stage is missional. These characters fully realize their missional purpose when they assume a mediator role that involves communicating between parties and sometimes securing benefits for each side. Joseph interprets a message from the God of the Hebrews to the king of the Egyptians, using his knowledge of both. In serving Pharaoh and blessing Egypt, he's a true descendant of Abraham, being blessed and blessing the nations. Joseph uses his knowledge of language, Egyptian eating customs, and his brother's birth order to conceal his identity from them. Then he identifies with his family, reveals his Hebrew name, and blesses his family using his Egyptian connections. He negotiates a win-win by placing his family in Goshen, where they watch the royal flock. He finally fulfills his dream. But Joseph still identifies with both cultures until his deathbed, even being buried in Egypt and later having his bones taken up to Israel. Moses realizes his mission back in Egypt as he ferries messages back and forth between God, Israel's leaders, and Pharaoh. Rejected by all, he persists. In the wilderness, he experiences the same tension. The Bible depicts him as the priest and prophet prototype, perhaps especially because of his in-between cultural status. Perhaps he's well suited for helping to shape a nation and culture in the limbo land of the wilderness. Daniel doesn't get bitter toward Babylon, nor abandon his Jewish identity. He serves 3 different foreign kings, interpreting dreams and signs from the Most High God in a language they can understand, but always reminding them which God he serves. The result is that the most powerful men in the world proclaim to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth the need to fear Daniel's God. Esther realizes her missional moment and diplomatically sets up the king for a conversation. She finally identifies as a Jew, calling them her people. When Haman falls on her couch, the king avenges her as his wife, but she again takes her identity and identifies with her people to secure their salvation. Through her dual identities, she mediates a solution to a pending genocide. Paul's bicultural background prepared him for mission in a Greco-Roman society, especially reconciling Jews and Gentiles into a united church, as he does in Romans. Eventually, it's Paul's rejection by the Jews and his Roman citizen card that enable him to proclaim the gospel to Herod, Felix, and Caesar, becoming a bicultural bridge no one else could have been. Jesus, too, is bicultural. Of course, the incarnational model for mission highlights how Jesus identified with humanity. The Nativities record his dual identity as human and divine by immediately giving him 2 names and 2 genealogies. He's dually rejected on the cross as his friends abandon him to face his Father's wrath. And the author of Hebrews points out how his human and divine qualities make him a perfect mediator. But we often miss the mixed human cultures in Jesus' life. As an infant, he was visited by Magi and the shepherds, became a political asylee in Egypt, and grew up in Galilee of the Gentiles. He also paid a temple visit to his father's house and was circumcised there. This is his unintentional early identification. In his ministry, he identified with diverse groups: a Samaritan, Syrophoenician, Roman centurion, Pharisees, fishermen, tax collectors, women, children, lepers, demon-possessed people, even the dead. He touches them, eats with them, teaches them. His own people, like his hometown and fellow rabbis, reject him because of his inclusion of the Gentiles and his identification with God. Even in his crucifixion, he offers salvation for all nations. As he weeps for Jerusalem, testifies to Pilate and the Sanhedrin, lets Simon of Cyrene carry the cross, and draws the Roman centurion to faith. Jesus' identification with the royal line of David and rejection by the Jews actually makes him into the prophesied Messiah who saves the nations. What applications does this have for missional models today? Literature on third culture kids has often focused on minimizing negative experiences. But this model shows that that very struggle to fit in and the pain of rejection can have significant purpose in God's mission. For one thing, people experiencing this are not alone. They have biblical role models. Those who support bicultural people can affirm ongoing identification with multiple cultures. They can look for ways that these skills and experiences might position them as missional mediators in the future. Another critique of this model is that it could only be applied to third culture kids who are in specific power dynamics. If you notice, all of these bicultural people were minorities under an oppressive power. So this application might be especially relevant to those bicultural people who have become bicultural in unjust political circumstances, such as refugees, asylees, and so forth. Of course, we can also take lessons from mission in general, since most missionaries don't fully know God's purposes when they go into the situation. It encourages us to know that God can use negative circumstances if we persist through rejection and continue to identify with multiple cultures. The Bible offers a model for how bicultural people are often used in God's mission. They identify with multiple cultures, even through rejection. Finally, God uses them as missional mediators in his plan to save the nations. Thanks for the opportunity to present today. My name is